The day he lost everything, no one even shook his hand. The banker didn't blink. But a year later, the whole town watched him walk into that same bank and sign the papers as the new owner. This is how it happened. You won't believe how he pulled it off. This is true Western justice. Quiet, clever, and long in the making. Subscribe to Quiet Rancher Stories and click like so this tale of justice reaches someone else who needs it. Clint Mercer ran his land by the book, not because he read many of them, but because it was the only way he knew how. He was 47, and the years had etched themselves onto his face like lines on an old map, each furrow a testament to sun, wind, and honest labor. Tough around the edges, yes, with hands like gnarled oak, but fair when the moment called for it. And never, not once in his entire life had he been late on a bill. That was a point of quiet pride, a steady beat in the rhythm of his days. Dust Hill Ranch wasn't just dirt and fences to him. It was a breathing thing, rooted deep in the valley soil. It was a piece of his father, then his grandfather, all the way back to the first Mercer who'd carved out a hard living in this unforgiving landscape. Clint remembered his father teaching him to mend a fence, his calloused hands guiding Clint's smaller ones. The smell of fresh-cut pine in the crisp morning air. He'd built every fence line by hand since then, repaired every leaky trough, pulled every carving calf into the world with his own sweat. He knew the land like the back of his hand, knew every dip and rise, every hidden spring, every stubborn rock that had to be moved before the plow could pass. He knew the way the sun hit the far ridge just before dawn, painting the sky in a haze of orange and purple. His life wasn't fancy. He drove an old Ford pickup, rusted at the fenders, that rattled like a tin can full of nails on a gravel road. His boots were always scuffed with the kind of red dust that meant honest work, meant he'd been out in the fields, not sitting behind a desk. He lived simple, ate what he raised, beef and corn most nights, and fixed what broke, mostly with wire and a few choice words. He had a modest farmhouse, nothing grand, but it was solid, built by his great-grandfather. The kitchen table, scarred from generations of meals and late-night paperwork, was where he'd sorted his seed, paid his taxes, and balanced his books. He didn't owe anyone a dime, not really, save for the bank. He had a loan, a big one, from Ember Ridge Bank, for a new irrigation system he'd put in a few years back, hoping to drought-proof the land. The last big payment was due in a year. After that, the deed would be fully, truly, undeniably his. He'd worked his whole life for that moment, for that absolute ownership. He saw it plain as day, just over the horizon, clear as the sunrise he watched every morning. He'd almost made it, just one more year. Then the valley got hit, and it got hit hard. Not a cloud in the sky for months, just that relentless brassy glare of the sun. The kind of drought that sucked the moisture right out of the air, turned the creek beds to cracked mud that crumbled underfoot, and made the distant mountains shimmer like a mirage, distorted and cruel. Dust Hill Ranch, like every other place around, withered. The grass, usually green and lush by early summer, turned brittle, then yellow, then a dusty brown that blew away on the slightest breeze. The pond, usually full of cattails and the croaking of bullfrogs, shrank day by day, until it was nothing more than a murky puddle, thick with algae, barely enough to slake the thirst of a single cow. His cattle, strong beasts a year ago, started looking gaunt, their ribs showing like accordions under their hides. He tried to hold on, like everyone else, clinging to the hope of rain. He watered them from the well, bucket by agonizing bucket, his muscles aching with the effort, watching the well water level drop lower and lower. But there was no feed. The crops he'd planted barely sprouted, tiny green shoots that quickly shriveled and died under the relentless sun, turning to powder in his fingers. He felt the land itself drying up, shrinking, pulling back from him. He sold things, bit by bit, trying to stave off the inevitable. First his old welding rig, then a couple of hand tools he rarely used, things that had belonged to his father. He sold his second horse, Old Bess, who'd been with him since she was a filly, her muzzle soft against his hand. That hurt. A deep, quiet ache that settled in his chest, a betrayal of a faithful companion. He watched her loaded onto the buyer's trailer, her ears flicking back at him, and it felt like a piece of him was being chipped away, sold off for a few dollars. Then he started selling off the cattle, good stock, sending them early to market at a fraction of their worth, knowing they'd just die on the land if he kept them. Each sale was a fresh cut. He sent what he could to the bank, always a little less than the full amount, praying for rain, for a miracle. He made it, barely, for a few months, scraping together every last penny, but one installment, the one due in late autumn, he missed by 3 weeks. 3 weeks, his first ever. He wrote a letter to Horace Linley, the sharp-dressed banker, explaining the situation, detailing the drought, asking for a grace period, just a little time to get back on his feet. He sealed the envelope himself, his thumb pressing down hard on the flap, hoping desperately for the best. He hated asking. He hated feeling vulnerable. But he had no choice. Horace Linley was a sharp-dressed man, always in a pressed suit, even on the hottest days, his starched collar seeming to choke off any hint of human warmth. He had thin lips that rarely smiled, and eyes that looked right through you, like you were just a number on a ledger, a line item to be tallied or dismissed. His office in Ember Ridge Bank was immaculate, smelling faintly of lemon polish and ambition, a stark contrast to the dust and sweat of Clint's world. Clint had only been in there a few times for the initial loan papers, and each time he felt like a piece of dirt tracked onto a Persian rug. Linley's response to Clint's letter arrived a week later. It wasn't a personal letter, not really. It was a formal bank notice, typewritten, not a single human touch to it. It was short, cold, no extension, it said. The bank's policy is firm. Default means immediate action. Clint read the words, then reread them, his fingers tracing the cold type, but they didn't change. 3 weeks, that's all it was. 3 weeks late on one payment, after decades of being early, after years of paying down this very loan. He crumpled the paper in his hand, the brittle sound of it like breaking bones. A quiet rage, cold and slow, began to coil in his gut. That same week, 2 men in dark coats showed up at Dust Hill Ranch. They weren't from the valley, that was clear. They moved like shadows, efficient and silent, carrying clipboards and cameras. They were from the bank, of course. Linley's men. Clint stood on his porch, rifle leaning against the doorframe, and watched them walk through his fields, documenting everything. The fences he'd built, piece by painstaking piece, each post a memory. The equipment he'd bought, the tractor, the plow, the quiet hum of their engines as he worked the land. The cattle he'd raised from calves, their familiar calls echoing across the parched fields. They impounded his remaining livestock, drove them off in a truck he didn't recognize, the dust kicked up by their hooves stinging his eyes. They put red tags on his tractor, his plow, his very tools, marking them for auction. The house was next, he knew. He stood there watching, the urge to fight, to simply put a bullet through the truck's tires, a hot spark in his chest. But what was the point? There were 2 of them, and no amount of bullets would stop the bank. He heard Linley say it later, to a small crowd gathering near the general store, his voice smooth and dismissive, carrying on the dry wind. It's business, not personal. Clint didn't say anything. He just watched the faces of the townsfolk, their pity, their fear, their quiet understanding that it could be them next. The words felt like a stone in his gut, cold and hard. Asterisk. Business asterisk. He looked back at his empty fields, the house that wasn't his anymore. Business. He wouldn't forget that. He walked away with next to nothing. The old Ford pickup, its engine rattling like a tin can full of loose bolts, a trusty rifle tucked behind the seat, and the clothes he wore on his back. Everything else, every last thing he'd worked for, everything his family had built over generations, stayed behind. The bank would sell it off, piece by piece, under the hammer of an auctioneer. He knew that. He knew the feeling of defeat, the heavy weight of it. But there was a new resolve, a hardening in his jaw, that hadn't been there before. He drove through Ember Ridge, the main street dusty and quiet in the midday sun. He saw the townsfolk stop, their conversations dying. He felt their glances, their half-hidden pity, the kind that made him want to grit his teeth. No one stepped in, though. No one offered help, or even a kind word, beyond a few mumbled "sorry, Clint." Everyone in Ember Ridge owed the bank something. Linley had them all by the throat, from the smallest shopkeeper to the biggest rancher. They were afraid, and Clint understood that fear. It wasn't anger he felt towards them. Not exactly. It was a quiet, almost sad understanding. They were just trying to survive, like him. But he wouldn't forget their turning away either. It was a quiet weight added to the stone in his gut. He didn't say goodbye to anyone. He just drove. He left the county line behind him, the familiar landmarks fading in his rearview mirror. He didn't tell a soul where he was headed. He didn't know himself. Not exactly. Just west, away from the dust and the pity and the bitter taste of defeat. His last glance in the rearview mirror was at the silhouette of Dust Hill, stark against the setting sun, a ghost of what it had been. He saw the empty fields, the house dark and silent, no smoke rising from the chimney. He saw the new tags on his equipment, glinting red in the fading light. A memory flickered, his father, teaching him to ride, a small boy on a pony, galloping across these very fields. His face was a mask, unreadable. But his jaw, though, was set, a hard, unyielding line. It was a quiet kind of anger, deep and slow burning, like coals under ash. The kind that didn't make a sound but just hardened, settling deep into his bones. He wasn't broken, he just felt like he'd been reset, recalibrated, and he had a very clear idea of what he would do next. He just needed to find the means. He didn't know what they were yet, but he knew they were out there, somewhere. Clint drove west, past the flat plains that stretched into forever, past the rolling hills, and finally into the jagged, indifferent mountains of Nevada. The landscape changed, turning from familiar green to stark red rock and scrub brush. He didn't know why, exactly, just that it was away from Ember Ridge, away from the smell of his ruined ranch, away from the whispers. He found his estranged uncle, a man named Silas, who lived out in a shack near a played-out gold claim that everyone else had abandoned years ago. Silas was a prospector, had been his whole life, his face weathered like old leather, his eyes keen despite his age. He'd struck a modest claim years ago, just enough to live on, a quiet existence far from anything resembling civilization. Silas was a quiet man, like Clint, and didn't ask many questions. He just gave Clint a cot in the corner of his one-room shack and a mug of strong, bitter coffee. For 4 months, Clint worked underground with Silas. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and stale dust, the clang of picks echoing in the narrow tunnels. He learned the basics of mining, the way to read the rock seams, how to swing a pickaxe without wasting a single ounce of effort, preserving his strength for hours of grueling work. Silas taught him, not with words but with gestures, with demonstrations, with a quiet grunt when Clint did something wrong. He learned prospecting, the tedious, precise way to pan for flecks of gold in a muddy stream, how to identify different ore samples, how to crush rock to see its hidden glimmer. He spent his days in the darkness, the only light from his headlamp, the only sound the scraping of tools against rock. No one knew him out here, no one cared about his past. He was just another faceless miner. It was a strange kind of anonymity, a blank slate that slowly began to heal something in him, replacing the bitter edges with a steely resolve. One afternoon while scouting for new veins, far from Silas's main claim, Clint discovered a neglected plot. It was a small rise of land, tucked away behind a stand of brittle pines, almost hidden from view. He saw surface signs of gold, just a few glints in the sun, small bits of quartz with visible veins of yellow running through them. He didn't make a fuss, didn't shout or jump. He just knelt, picked up a sample, and crumbled it in his calloused fingers. The weight of it, the way it broke apart, the subtle gleam. He felt a quiet certainty settle in his chest. It was there, he knew it. He went back to Silas that night, his face unreadable as usual. He offered Silas a quiet sum for the lease, a private agreement for this small, overlooked piece of ground. Silas, a man of few words, just looked at him, then at the small rock Clint held in his palm. He nodded. "Good luck, son," he rasped. No questions, no expectations, just a quiet understanding between two men. Winter clamped down on the Nevada hills, turning the red rock peaks white and silent. Snow piled deep against Silas's shack, and the wind howled through the canyons, a lonely, mournful sound. But Clint kept working. He started extracting ore from his newly leased plot. Not much at first, just small amounts he could carry by hand, load into the back of his old Ford, and haul down to the nearest general store for initial processing. He shipped it discreetly, sending it out in unmarked crates, never to the same buyer twice, using different routes, different couriers, scattering his tracks like dust in the wind. The claim was on unregistered private land, a loophole Silas had pointed out. So no one knew what he was doing out there in the freezing quiet. No official forms, no land surveys, no government eyes watching. Just him, the mountain, and the slow, steady work. He'd send samples to assay offices in Denver, renowned for their accuracy, always under a fake name, always with a return address that led to a post office box in a town 100 miles away. The reports came back surprisingly fast, sent in plain envelopes, shockingly high purity, they said in their dry scientific language. Better than anything Silas had seen in years, better than most of the claims that made headlines. Clint folded the papers, tucked them away in a waterproof pouch he kept strapped to his chest, under his shirt. He kept it secret, didn't tell a soul, not even Silas, who never asked. It was his secret, his solitary act of creation. He wasn't after wealth, not the kind that came with a fancy house and a new suit, the kind Linley paraded around in. He was after something else entirely. He was after leverage. He didn't want to be rich. He wanted to be powerful. He wanted to own what had tried to own him. The gold wasn't treasure, it was a weapon. Every glint of yellow, every ounce he pulled from the earth, was a silent, shining piece of his revenge. He knew exactly what he was going to do with it. He just had to wait, to be patient, to build his quiet fortune in the cold, dark silence of the mountain. He saw Ember Ridge in his mind's eye, the bank building, Linley's smug face, and he knew with a certainty that settled deep into his bones that the time was coming. Slowly, inevitably. The spring thaw brought the first trickle of meltwater down the mountains, carving new paths in the packed snow. It brought a different kind of thaw to Clint's resolve too, a sense of readiness. He packed his truck, a sparse collection of clothes, his rifle, and his now heavy pouch. He left Silas with a quiet handshake and a promise to visit, a nod of shared understanding. Then he turned the old Ford east, back towards Ember Ridge, the dusty plains stretching out before him like a memory. He looked worn, his face etched with more lines than before, his skin tanned dark by the high desert sun, his clothes faded and dusty, the same as they'd been when he left. He drove into town looking quiet, harmless, just another tired ranch hand passing through. Most folks barely recognized him. His year away had put a quiet change in his eyes, a depth that wasn't there before. Some did, of course, the ones who had known him best, but they just offered a hesitant nod, not knowing what to say to the man who'd lost everything. He rented a small, cramped room at the back of the feed store, overlooking the alley. It smelled of hay and dust, a comforting, familiar scent that took him back to his own barn. The cot sagged in the middle, and the single window was streaked with grime, but it was a place to lay his head, a place no one would think to look for the man who was quietly building an empire. He didn't talk to anyone, didn't try to explain where he'd been or what he'd done. He wasn't here for explanations. He was here for something else entirely. He spent his days sitting in the saloon, nursing a single cup of lukewarm coffee he barely tasted. He'd read the local newspapers, sometimes the ones from the next county over, absorbing the news of the town, the prices of cattle, the gossip. Mostly, he just watched. He watched the people who came and went, the way they moved, their shoulders a little more slumped, their eyes a little more wary. He watched the way they avoided eye contact with certain men, especially the ones who came and went from the bank. He watched the bank itself, that solid brick building on Main Street, its presence casting a long shadow over the town. He saw Linley's shiny carriage roll past, drawn by 2 fat horses, its polished wood gleaming. He just watched, a ghost in his own hometown, observing the changes, taking it all in. The emotional impact of being back was subtle, a dull ache that surfaced when he saw a familiar face, a familiar building. It was a strange feeling, being home, but not truly asterisk of asterisk it anymore. He was an outsider, looking in, and that perspective gave him a clarity he hadn't had before. Ember Ridge was still under the bank's thumb, even more so now. It felt like a town slowly suffocating, tied up in knots of debt and obligation. Horace Linley, the sharp-suited banker, was now on the town council. He practically ran the place, his influence seeping into every decision, every new regulation. He flaunted his power like a prize ribbon, a shiny badge of his success. He'd built himself a fancy house on the edge of town, big and imposing, with manicured lawns and a gate that seemed designed to keep the world out. He rode around in a closed carriage, drawn by those plump, well-fed horses, like he owned the very air of Ember Ridge. And in a way he did. Clint sat in the saloon, day after day, watching. He saw others go through what he had gone through. He saw families evicted from their farms, their worn furniture piled out in the street, gathering dust. He watched children cling to their mothers' skirts, their eyes wide and frightened as their homes were stripped from them. He saw public auctions where desperate men, their faces etched with despair, sold their livelihoods for pennies on the dollar, just to clear a fraction of their debt. He overheard conversations, whispered fragments of fear and resentment. Linley's taking everything. No one can stop him. The town had a quiet despair about it, a resignation that was almost palpable. Everyone just accepted it. They murmured, they complained behind closed doors, but no one thought it could be beaten. Linley was too powerful, the bank too big, too entrenched. He was the only game in town. Clint didn't comment, didn't offer a sympathetic word. He just listened. He heard the names of the families losing their land. He heard the specific dates of their foreclosures. He heard the reasons, the arbitrary policies Linley put into place, the interest rates that seemed to climb without warning. He took notes, careful notes. He'd bought a small leather-bound book, and each day he filled page after page with names, dates, policies, and prices. He was building something, quietly, steadily, with every word, every observation. He was collecting the pieces of the puzzle, watching the patterns. The injustice burned, a cold, steady flame inside him. He remembered Linley's words. It's business, not personal. He watched the faces of the people, the hopelessness in their eyes, and a quiet resolve hardened in his chest. They might think it couldn't be beaten, but he knew better. He knew it could, and he was the one who would do it. He drove to the next county over, a town called Havenwood, a place just big enough to have a proper lawyer's office, one that didn't know everyone's business. The lawyer was a young man, sharp and efficient, with shrewd eyes that saw more than he let on. Clint spoke plainly, outlining his needs without revealing too much. He wanted to open 2 shell companies, anonymous things, just names on paper, under aliases that weren't his own. The lawyer didn't bat an eye. Clint saw the glint of curiosity in his eyes, but no questions were asked. The lawyer just nodded, presented the papers, and Clint signed, his hand steady. It felt like putting on a new skin, a disguise no one in Ember Ridge would ever suspect. He started moving the money he'd made from the gold, bit by bit. Not all at once, never in one big chunk that would draw attention. He was a ghost in the market, scattering his investments like seeds in the wind. He bought stock in Ember Ridge Bank, small amounts at first, through different brokers, under different names, always making sure no one could connect the dots back to Clint Mercer. A few shares here, a few shares there. It was painstaking work, slow and methodical, like panning for gold, one tiny flake at a time. Each acquisition was a quiet victory, a small piece of the bank returning to his hands, unseen. Then he started buying debt notes. These were the promises of money owed to the bank, things that would normally be sold off at a discount by other larger institutions. He acquired them slowly, methodically, always through his shell companies, always through different channels. Some of these notes were even issued by Linley's own bank, debts that Ember Ridge Bank owed to other, bigger lenders. He bought them all, patiently waiting for them to come on the market. He built up a quiet stack of paper, legal documents that held the bank's future in their balance. Slowly, almost invisibly, Clint Mercer, the ranch hand who'd lost everything, was becoming the majority debt holder of Ember Ridge Bank. The power was shifting, unnoticed by Linley, by the bank's few other scattered investors, by the entire town. It was like watching a river change course, imperceptibly at first, then undeniably. Each purchase, each signed document, fueled a quiet, grim satisfaction within him. He was building his leverage, brick by silent brick, preparing for the day when he would finally call in his chips. The bank was his, on paper, and no one knew it. Not yet. Clint found an old miner, one of Silas's acquaintances from his Nevada days, who was looking to sell his property in Ember Ridge. It was a small piece of land, just a few acres, with a ramshackle shack on it. But it was strategically located. It was on the edge of town, practically overlooking the bank, Linley's fancy new house, and the entire valley. It was perfect. Clint bought it outright. No fuss, no loans. He started building immediately. Not a grand structure, nothing flashy, just a small, unassuming office, a single room with a desk, a few chairs, and a sturdy safe. He did much of the work himself, hauling lumber, hammering nails, the familiar ache in his muscles a welcome companion. He registered it under the name Mercer & Company Finance. No fanfare, no grand announcement, just a simple sign, made of plain pine, nailed above the door. It was subtle, too subtle perhaps for most folks to notice its true significance. Linley, of course, saw it. He chuckled to his cronies in the saloon one afternoon, his voice dripping with condescension. Some ranch hand playing banker now? Mercer & Company Finance? He scoffed, loud enough for Clint to hear from his table in the corner. What's he going to do? Offer loans for a dozen head of cattle? Or maybe finance a new chicken coop? Linley's friends guffawed, their loud, booming laughter filling the room, echoing with the town's silent despair. Clint didn't reply. He just folded his newspaper slowly, carefully, slid his empty coffee cup aside, and stood up. He walked out, his steps measured, his back ramrod straight. He didn't need to say anything. The time for talking was over. The time for showing was about to begin. Every quiet step he'd taken, every secret investment, every hour spent in the mine, had led to this. The final note was about to be played, a discordant sound that would shatter Linley's carefully constructed world. He felt the weight of it, the delicious, slow-burning anticipation. It was almost time. The bank's annual investor board meeting was always held in the biggest room in Ember Ridge, the one above the general store, usually a dusty space rented out for dances and town hall gatherings. Today it was set up formally, a long polished oak table at its center, surrounded by stiff-backed chairs. The air was thick with expectation, the low murmur of nervous small investors, the aging widows who relied on dividends to live. Linley arrived late, as always, striding in with his usual smug confidence, adjusting his expensive silk tie. His eyes scanned the room, a quick, dismissive glance at the familiar faces. He expected the usual sycophants, the timid investors who dared not question his authority. But when his gaze landed at the head of the table, he stopped dead. His jaw visibly slackened. Clint Mercer was already seated, quiet, unmoving, looking out the window at the town he had just, piece by piece, claimed. He didn't stand, didn't offer a greeting. He just turned, his eyes calm and unwavering. Meeting Linley's shocked gaze, he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to the lawyer, the quiet man from Havenwood, who stood beside him, a stack of crisp, official-looking documents held loosely in his hands. The lawyer stepped forward, his voice clear and even, cutting through the sudden silence in the room. By virtue of a series of registered transactions, duly processed and recorded, Mercer and Company Finance now holds 51% of the total outstanding stock and debt notes of Ember Ridge Bank. A gasp rippled through the room. Linley's face went from pale to a ghastly white. He opened his mouth, then closed it, no words coming out. His authority, his control, every single bit of power he'd held, was stripped from him right there, in front of everyone who had ever feared him. The lawyer continued, detailing the legalities, the transfers, the new corporate structure. Linley looked like a man who'd just been hit by a train, his eyes darting around the room, begging for someone to deny it, to say it was a joke, but no one did. The silence was absolute. Clint looked at Linley then, his gaze steady, devoid of triumph, but filled with a quiet, unyielding power. "Now," he said, his voice low, clear, and utterly calm, cutting through the stunned silence, "it's personal." The other board members, a mix of local businessmen and wealthy landowners, stared, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning realization. The bank was no longer Linley's. It was Clint Mercer's. The next day, Ember Ridge woke up to a different kind of quiet. A strange, expectant hum seemed to hang in the air. People moved with a subtle shift in their shoulders, a tentative hope in their eyes. Then, like a ripple spreading through a still pond, the news hit. A notice was posted on every storefront in Ember Ridge, nailed to saloon doors, tacked onto general store bulletin boards, stuck to the side of the blacksmith shop. It was printed simply, in bold black letters, "New ownership, Ember Ridge Bank." Below that, a smaller, even more impactful line, "Effective immediately, all pending foreclosures are suspended. All backdated interest on loans for farmers and ranchers is forgiven." It was signed, Mercer and Company Finance. People stopped dead in their tracks. Old Man Hemlock, a grizzled farmer who was about to lose his family land next week, stood staring at the paper for a full 5 minutes, his gnarled hand slowly reaching out to touch the words, as if to make sure they were real, not some cruel mirage. A young family, already packing their few belongings into a wagon, saw the notice outside the post office. The mother burst into quiet tears. The father just stood there, hat in hand, his face a mixture of disbelief and sudden, overwhelming relief. The saloon went silent when the news reached it, the usual morning chatter dying away. Farmers, their faces worn with years of worry and the recent drought, looked at each other, then at the notice, then back at each other, a tentative, fragile hope sparking in their eyes. They didn't know what to make of it, this sudden reprieve. Clint stayed silent through it all. He sat in his small office at Mercer and Company Finance, a cup of coffee growing cold on his desk. He watched from his window as the town slowly reacted, the disbelief turning to stunned whispers, then to cautious celebration. He saw the groups forming, pointing at the notices, their voices rising with a new, hesitant energy. He had done it. He hadn't just won back his ranch. He had changed the very air the town breathed. He had taken the stranglehold off Ember Ridge. He just let the town react, let the news sink in. He didn't need to explain, didn't need to celebrate. The act itself was enough. The quiet shift in the town's atmosphere, from resignation to a flicker of hope, was his reward. Horace Linley's world unraveled fast, faster than the unraveling of a cheap burlap sack. The very next morning, the two silent men in dark coats, the same ones who had served Clint his foreclosure notice, arrived at the bank. This time they were serving Linley his own eviction papers. He was removed from his fancy office, his polished mahogany desk, his impressive leather chair, his personal effects, a silver-framed photo of his stern-faced parents, a small collection of valuable books were unceremoniously boxed and piled in the street outside, gathering dust. His expensive carriage, the one he used to flaunt his wealth, the one drawn by two fat, well-fed horses, was repossessed by a grim-faced clerk from the next county. The irony was thick enough to taste, a bitter tang in the air. He paced the dusty streets, his custom-made boots now scuffing in the grit, his pressed suit rumpled and stained. He tried to leave town, to slip away in the night, just as Clint had done. He packed a small valise, hailed a horse-drawn buggy, and tried to head for the county line, hoping to disappear into the vastness of the West. But it was too late. Clint had made sure of it. While acquiring the bank's debts, Clint had quietly discovered Linley's own undeclared assets, the little side investments and properties he'd hidden away to avoid taxes, the secret accounts he'd kept. Clint had reported them, of course, anonymously, through one of his shell companies, a few weeks prior. Now the county tax office was after him. Just as he approached the county line, a sheriff's deputy, stern-faced and unyielding, stopped him. He found himself owing a staggering amount in back taxes, fines on undeclared assets, money he'd thought no one knew about, money he couldn't possibly pay. He was trapped. The man who had taken everything from so many, who had claimed it's business not personal, now found himself with nothing, his escape routes cut off. He stood on the dusty road outside Ember Ridge, the setting sun casting long, mocking shadows. His face was a mask of disbelief and pure, unadulterated fear. He tried to argue, to bluster, but his voice cracked, his usual smug composure gone. He looked like a desperate, broken man. His fine suit and polished shoes a stark contrast to his sudden, utter ruin. He had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. Clint, watching from his office window, saw him standing there, a lone figure against the horizon. The revenge was complete, and it had been perfectly, coldly, personal. Locals began to visit Clint at his small office, the new Mercer & Company, finance building on the edge of town. They came one by one, then in small groups, a hesitant procession. Old man Hemlock, tears in his eyes, offered his heartfelt thanks. Families whose homes had been saved stammered out their gratitude. Some offered awkward apologies, remembering how they'd turned their backs, how they'd whispered about him, how they'd failed to offer a helping hand when he lost Dust Hill. They shifted their weight, looked at their dusty boots, unsure of how to face the man who had been their quiet savior. Clint listened. He offered quiet nods, a steady gaze that saw everything but gave nothing away. He never forgot who had laughed, or who had looked away, the day he lost his ranch. Forgiveness wasn't free, it had to be earned. He was a just man, not a sentimental one. He made quiet decisions, based not on emotion but on character. He rehired 2 of his old ranch hands, Jed and Silas. Not the uncle, but another old-timer. Men who had stood by him in the tough years before the drought, who hadn't whispered or turned away. They'd simply offered a silent nod of sympathy. He gave them raises, good wages that let a man feed his family, put a new roof on his home. They were his first employees, his most trusted. He knew their loyalty was true. Then, one quiet morning, he drove out to Dust Hill Ranch. The land still carried the scars of the drought, but green shoots were pushing through the parched earth, hopeful and persistent. The house, though vacant for a year, still felt like home. He walked the property lines, his boots kicking up dust, remembering every fence post, every stone wall. He went to the county records office, and through Mercer & Company Finance, he bought it back. It was his, again. But he left the old, weather-beaten signpost down. It didn't need to say Dust Hill Ranch anymore. Everyone knew what it was. It was just home. His home. The land felt different now, no longer a weight of debt, but a promise of future. He felt the quiet, profound satisfaction of reclaiming what was rightfully his, not through violence, but through wit. A year to the day since it was taken, since he'd watched the bank's men drive off with his cattle. Clint rode up to the ranch. It was spring again, and the land was gloriously greening, recovering from the long, brutal drought. The fields, once cracked and barren, were now a vibrant tapestry of young grass, swaying gently in the breeze. The creek, which had shrunk to a muddy trickle, now flowed with a clear, steady current, its banks lush with new growth. He stopped on a small rise overlooking the main pasture, letting his horse breathe, listening to the buzzing of bees and the chirping of unseen birds. He saw the sun hit the hills just right, painting them in hues of gold and amber, the same way it did when he was a boy, riding with his father, learning the names of the trees. It felt like coming home, truly home, for the first time in a long while, the bitterness slowly fading, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. He dismounted near the main house, which he'd started to repair with the help of Jed and Silas. The windows were clean, the porch swept, and a new coat of paint already drying on the front door. He knelt, and with his own hands, dug a small hole near the porch swing. He planted a small pecan sapling there, its slender trunk barely thicker than his thumb, its few leaves trembling in the gentle wind. It was just a little thing, frail against the vastness of the land, but it was a promise, a symbol, a sign that this land would outlive bitterness, that something new and strong would grow from the ashes of what had been lost. It wasn't about the fruit it would bear in 20 years. It was about the act of planting, the act of looking forward. Later that afternoon, an old farmer named Jeb, one of the men Clint had helped save from foreclosure, rode up on his tired mare and watched him work. He leaned against the fence, chewing on a stalk of grass. "Clint," he said, his voice slow and curious, "after all that, why'd you come back? Why not just stay out there with your gold, live a rich man's life?" Clint straightened, wiping dirt from his hands onto his worn denim trousers. He looked out at the greening fields stretching towards the horizon, then back at the small, fragile sapling, its leaves unfurling to the sun. He smiled, a rare, small smile that softened the hard lines of his face. "Because I never really left, Jeb," he replied, his voice quiet, almost a whisper against the vastness of the valley. "I was just buying time." And he had, in ways no one in Ember Ridge had ever imagined. Clint didn't just run the bank, he reshaped it. The cold, impersonal institution Horace Linley had molded into his own private fiefdom was transformed, slowly but surely, into a pillar of the community. Clint set up a community lending program, offering low-interest, sometimes even no-interest, loans for young ranchers and struggling farmers. He remembered how close he'd come to losing everything, how a small grace period could have changed his fate. He provided that grace. He helped families buy their first breeding stock, helped others replace broken equipment, the kind of hand-up he never got when he needed it most. He used the bank's profits, the very money Linley had hoarded, to benefit the people, not just a select few. He also started a larger project, on a plot of land that was once Linley's private hunting lodge, a piece of ground Linley had gloated about. Clint began building, not a fancy mansion, but a new schoolhouse. The old one was crumbling, outdated. This one would be solid, bright, with big windows, and enough room for all the children in the valley. He watched the construction, often pitching in himself, hauling lumber, his hands still strong. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The place where Linley had once hunted deer now housed the future of Ember Ridge. Clint never married, never settled down in that way. His life was the ranch, the bank, and the town. But he mentored the next generation of ranchers, teaching them not just about cattle and crops, but about financial prudence, about community, about the long game. He'd spend hours talking to young men and women in his office, sharing his hard-won wisdom, his quiet observations. He became a quiet patriarch for the valley, a man known not for what he took, but for what he gave back. One quiet afternoon, he took an old piece of cedar, weathered and strong, smoothed it with his calloused hands, and carved his father's name into it. He drove it into the ground near the main road, a new gatepost for Dust Hill Ranch, sturdy and resolute. Under his father's name, he carved his own, not for pride, but for memory, for the legacy. It was a silent testament to the man he was and the land he'd saved. Years went by, slipping into the quiet rhythms of the valley. Clint Mercer, older now, his hair mostly white, his shoulders still broad but a little stooped with age, still rode alone across his land. He didn't ride a fancy horse, just a steady old mare named Daisy that knew every step of the trail, every dip and rise of Dust Hill. The pecan tree he'd planted years ago was tall now, its branches reaching wide, providing generous shade for the next generation of children playing on the porch, their laughter carrying on the breeze. He'd ride, sometimes for hours, just watching the land, feeling its pulse. He'd stop at the creek bed, the same one where he'd first learned to rope cattle as a boy, sitting beside his father, who'd taught him the quiet wisdom of the land. The water ran clear and cold, just as it always had, a constant, comforting sound. He'd pause at the top of the ridge, looking down at the thriving valley, at the new schoolhouse, at the prosperous farms, at the steady, quiet hum of a town that had finally found its footing. He saw no more foreclosures, no more desperate auctions, just honest work and honest living. The sun set slow and gold over the Ember Ridge Mountains, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple, then fading to a deep, peaceful twilight. He sat there for a long time, watching the first stars begin to prick the darkening sky, feeling the cool night air settle on his face. He never spoke about what he'd done, not really, not in detail. He didn't need to. The town remembered. They remembered the ranch hand who lost everything, and then bought the bank. They remembered the quiet, relentless man who had turned the tide. He wasn't a hero in the grand shouting sense, but he was a legend, whispered about around campfires and dinner tables. The land, saved and thriving, spoke for him. The children, learning in the new school, were his testament. Some men win with bullets, others with banks. Clint Mercer won with time, with patience, and with a quiet, unyielding will. He just sat there, listening to the land, content,